Welcome to the Real People, Real Business show, where we're talking with business owners who are in the trenches, everyday people who are working hard and have relevant and inspiring stories that you can relate to. Everyone we speak to is actively building and growing their business and is here to share their experience, lessons, wisdom, and guidance so you can be inspired to take action towards your own goals. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Jürgen Strauss. Jürgen partners with innovative, exceptional business coaches and consultants to build their professional credibility and connect with their ideal clients. His company enables them to acquire more leads and more business by reaching their ideal target audience with their message. Welcome to the show, Jürgen. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a real privilege to be with you and speak to you from the other side of the world.
Yeah, you're down in Australia, right?
That's right.
Well, I am so pleased that you were able to make the time to talk to us. I met Jürgen when I was interviewed on his podcast last year sometime, I think, maybe even earlier than that. We had a really great connection. So I was really excited when he agreed to come on the show and talk to us about the work that he's doing. So without further ado, why don't we just dive in? Tell me a little bit about how you got to where you are right now and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting journey, and I always laugh when I ask people that on my podcast and they give me the story and they say it's a very convoluted and windy path to get me here, but in hindsight, it kind of sounds like very strategic, and it's a little bit similar to me. So I had a long corporate career. And one of the very early experiences in my corporate career was something that I think shaped my whole attitude to innovation and ideas and being at the forefront of your own field. And that was in the photography game. So I was trained as a chemist. I'm a very keen hobby photographer. And my first job was actually in a research division of one of the big photography companies, right about the time when the first digital cameras came onto the consumer market. And of course, the film manufacturers like Kodak and Agfa, who was the company I worked for, at first were shocked and didn't know how to react to this, but then ultimately decided that film was always going to be better than digital photography. And so they kind of ignored the threat. And even though I was one of the few people at Agfa that I was involved in a task force to research this new technology. And I was one of the few people that said, whilst the quality of the early products was quite bad, it was proof of concept. And I thought that there was going to be a real danger from this. And that at the time, I remember saying 20 years, it could be mainstream, and I was wrong because it was 10 years. So that kind of shaped my attitude to the whole idea of innovation and making sure that you're aware of the environment you're working in and what's going on there, and you're adept to making changes in your own business model and how you're serving the customers. So the other thing that it taught me was that serving the customer, you have to be really clear about what it is you're doing for the customer. So Agfa and Kodak and the other film manufacturers thought they were making photographic film and photographic paper for photographers, hobby photographers and professional photographers. But what they were really doing was providing people a means to capture memories. And so if you look at it from that point of view, the concept of capturing memories, how else can you do that? And of course, digital, as we know today, is a much more convenient way to do that for people. So that was my start. Then I had, as I said, quite a long corporate career. I went through various roles from managing people across the globe. I think at one point I was managing teams in 7 different countries and 7 different languages, 7 different cultures. So that was quite a challenge and quite a learning experience. So it was a lot of fun too. And when I got to the point in my corporate career where I was no longer enjoying it, and it took me 2 years to really realize this, that I had to make a change because it just wasn't like it was at odds with my values, because there were a whole lot of things happening in the company I was working for, reorganizations and change in culture that was kind of seeping in. So ultimately, I was given a choice to either take a big cut in pay and big cut in responsibility, and or leave. So I chose the latter and took a package and started up my own business, and decided that I'd go from a big international corporation and traveling the world 30% of my time to having a much more quieter life in a local business. And that proved a new challenge, because whilst I had lots of connections and a big community internationally, I really wasn't known all that well and didn't have a lot of connections in the small business community locally. So I had to build all that up, and started out with marketing services for small business and building systems for their marketing. And over time, it evolved into something that was sort of now focused very much on podcasting, but also just providing ways for my clients to get visibility and professional credibility out in the public, but particularly through the internet, and engage with their ideal clients. And one of the things, as I kind of learned that my kind of technical bent, and also I love technology, had people come to me for help with all the technology, I realized that people were starting to abdicate a lot of the human-to-human interactions to the technology. So I'm all about using the technology to actually enable more of those human-to-human interactions, such as what we're doing now.
I love that. This is actually one of the reasons that I insist on all of my coaching calls being on video. I know a lot of coaches who will only do them audio because it's easier for them, but there's so much missing when you can't see someone's face and really interpret how they're receiving what you're saying. So that resonates a lot with me. I want to go back. So you went from a chemist in a film development in a large film based organization to now working in marketing. So like that was a leap, and there was a little bit of a journey in there, right?
That's right.
How did that transition happen?
Well, when I left the photography industry after about 6 years there, because I saw the writing on the wall and I didn't think there was a future in where I was at the time, and I landed a position at a company that made specialty chemicals for the coatings industry. So they were B2B. So I went from what was a kind of a partly B2B but largely B2C, business to consumer company, to a business to business organization that provided raw materials. So I started out there in a laboratory role, then started in people management, and I managed laboratories across those 7 countries that I mentioned. And part of my career progression, then I moved into some business management roles and some marketing roles, and then did some things around supply chain. So a lot of things in different roles. So I guess one of the things I did as I progressed through those roles was a marketing degree, and I spent time at Wharton, which was fun and learnt a lot there. And the other thing I also was very, very active in was developing systems and writing up systems, documenting systems for processes, as I call them, that people typically didn't think of as a process as such. For example, a product development, a new product development process was one of the big ones we did. And we started off with, the idea, from the idea stage right through to delivering the product to the customer as a documented process, and how you do that. So that was the other part that came in to the marketing. So when I went into small business, a lot of those things came together so that we put together documented processes of how to do things in marketing and product launches, and now with podcasting. And so that allowed us to help people, and it also, the documented processes form the basis for training programs that we do. And that was how that transition happened.
So it was something that happened over time, and you were that sort of classic case study of someone who comes out of the line of line of business, more technical work, and slowly realizes that there's a whole business on top of
That's right. Yeah.
technology, right? And one of the places that you and I connected was around innovation and innovation management. And I know you've got part of your story in that area as well. But I like what you're saying about processes, because part of what I knew about innovation management, and I did all my post-grad work in innovation management, was that innovation is not typically managed as a process. It's typically looked as something like a big sandbox, a big free-for-all creative. But what we learned was that innovation actually does need to be managed, and it needs to become a process. And I don't think that's that different than how we need to deal with marketing in our businesses. I teach people to create marketing habits, and that those habits are built upon processes. So something that's typically viewed as very creative does better when it actually has some substance and function behind it. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So I like to think of it as having frameworks. So the process, you can write up a process really detailed. And for example, if you take, so I'm just baking some bread right now while we're speaking, it's in the oven, and there's recipes that you can have for bread. So when I first started and I was learning, I followed the recipe step by step. So here's when you add the wheat, here's when you add water, here's when you add the salt, and so on. Now I kind of know, the order of when things have to happen, and I can be creative. So I have the framework and I deviate from that. So sometimes I might put the salt in later. Sometimes I'll add some seeds or different ingredients just to experiment with it. But I know the overall framework. So without that framework, I'd be kind of lost. There'd be some critical steps that I miss and it wouldn't work. And so I see innovation processes or marketing, or even just, what we were talking about earlier, the human interaction. I see even that as a process, but within that, if you have it as a framework, then you still have the ability to be adaptable to the environment, to the people involved, or to the particular case that you're working on.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need buckets, and the buckets are the places, that things that keep you kind of contained and focused. But within those buckets, you need the room to be creative, right? So there's this constant push and pull of discipline and function along with creativity. And when you can find that sort of right mix, then that is the foundation for most things in your business that require you to be creative in some way, which is innovation, which is marketing, which is basically most of what you're doing, right?
Yeah. And a lot of creativity or innovation relies on asking really good questions. And if there's questions that you can list out that are common to any situation. And so if you remember to ask all those questions and then follow on with a conversation around, depending on who you're asking the question of and what the answer is. Like, for example, working with a customer, you have a bunch of questions. What specifically do you need? And then different questions of how to dig into that and how to find out why that's important and what the underlying need might be of the first expressed need. That if you have those list of questions as part of your process, that helps you actually remember to ask them all and elicit the information that will help you then move forward.
Yep. And I think that there's an element of experience in there too, right? I mean, the risk with having something too structured is that if you're not comfortable or you don't feel confident in the work that you're doing, just following a script is actually going to do the opposite of creativity and innovation. But these are great guidelines to make sure we're checking off all the boxes, but we have the ability to kind of riff on wherever we're going in our area of expertise. But I'm the same way. This is why I'm a huge proponent of people building a little bit of structure into their programs that they're delivering and the work that they're doing with their clients, so that it helps their clients believe that they're going to be able to deliver, but also gives them a little bit of more confidence in what they're doing, because they know that they can fall back on their process if they need to.
Yeah, that's right. A really good example of that is with my podcast. I mean, it's an interview podcast. And in the very early days, I had a script and I had probably a list of about 40 questions that I would just work through one by one. And those very early episodes were quite stilted because they were so heavily scripted, and I lacked the confidence to stray too much from the script. Whereas now I typically have 5 bullet points of topics that I'll touch on. I do have some parts of it still scripted, but I've got those pretty well in my head, so I can vary the words and how I express the questions or the conversation at that point. The 5 bullet points just give me things to hit in the conversation, and often we only get to one, depending how the conversation goes. So I might start off with, okay, let's dig into this topic, and the conversation just goes into a bunch of rabbit holes there, but we have a great conversation, and there's still 4 bullet points that I'd prepared for, but we don't touch on. So I have that flexibility.
The conversation becomes a lot more rich when you're able to speak as human beings, right? But we've got something to fall back on in case we need it. But so this is a great segue into your focusing almost primarily on podcasting now. And so tell me a little bit more about how you work with your clients.
So that's an interesting journey. I mean, when I first started the podcast, I mentioned earlier that I had all these international connections. So when a business coach of mine suggested I should start a podcast to position myself in the marketplace, I thought, wow, that's a great way to connect back in with all those international connections I have. So that was how I started. And then they connected me with a lot of people. So first of all, it became a great networking tool for me. And that's how we met, through networking through other guests that I'd had on the show. And then I started really enjoying it. And of course, what happens once you're enjoying something and you're doing it and it's very public and it's successful, people come to you and say, oh, how could I do that? And so that's how I kind of got into helping other people set up their podcasts. And so what we do now is we'll help people launch a podcast. We'll help them produce it, or we'll produce it for them. So we've got a whole bunch of podcasts that we're producing. I also have one client who I'm on the podcast with him. So he was running a weekly podcast where he would talk about a topic, and typically it would go about 3 to 5 minutes. And he said to me at the time we started our conversation, I'm not getting a lot of feedback or a lot of engagement from my audience. And I listened to several of his episodes and I thought, well, he's got a great message, but each episode, it kind of reels me in. And then I'm thinking, oh, this is getting interesting. And then he kind of finishes. So it's like leaving me hanging, thinking, oh, I really wanted to hear more about that. And then the next episode, the following week, he's on another topic. So I said to him, you really need to flesh out those topics more and talk a little bit more. And so what we ended up doing was I'm now his straight man, if you like, on the episode. So he'll start talking about that topic and I will just ask questions like, well, why is that important? Or can you give us an example of that? Or I might challenge him sometimes and say, well, what if it's different? And that's been really successful, and he's starting to get lots of really good feedback on that. So, I do that occasionally. As I say, we produce them. And also because, as I mentioned before, we've got everything set up as very clear systems and how we work through these things. So we use those documents to build training programs around the whole podcasting space as well. So I do in-person training programs, and we're working right now on building some online training programs around a couple of things, around setting up your own podcast, building that podcast out to grow your audience. So essentially the marketing part of the podcast. Also around being a really good host and being a really good guest. So there's lots, I'm sure you find this too, that sometimes you get a guest that isn't as well prepared as they perhaps could be. And of course, that's not serving your audience, but it also doesn't showcase them in their best light. So one of the big differences of our training programs, because there are a lot of really good training programs out there, but one of the big differences of ours is again, that focus on the human aspect of it, and how can you as a host be really well prepared and make sure that you showcase your guest from their best, and how can you as a guest, if you're participating on someone else's podcast like I am now, how can you prepare yourself well enough and then show up as your best?
So I think the big question out there for people is a podcast right for me, right? And who does best with this kind of vehicle?
That's a really good question. I guess there's other ways to get your message out. Clearly, there's I really like video as well, but a lot of people feel uncomfortable going on video, and also feel intimidated by the technology for both video and for podcasting, which that's where I say, look, if you get started, you don't need a lot to get started. It doesn't have to be complicated. We all have our smartphones these days, and essentially we've got a video camera in there that's better than the expensive video cameras that were around 10 years ago. So it's easy from the technology point of view to put something together, and then posting it online somewhere is fairly easy as well. The key thing really is, what's the message? Well, who's the audience, first of all? Who's the audience you're trying to reach? What's the message you're bringing to them? How do you add value to them? They're the key things. And if you ask yourself those questions around your whole marketing program, then it starts to highlight, where do those people hang out? How do I reach them best? And so if the answer to that is, well, for example, let's say there's stay-at-home mums that are running their own business. Well, they're pretty busy, right? They're juggling their business and their family commitments. And so I could imagine that a podcast for them is a really convenient way for them to take in information and learn, because they can listen to a podcast while they're doing other things. They can listen to the podcast while they're driving the kids to and from school, or they could listen to the podcast while they're doing some of the housework that they might have to do. So, if you imagine who is the audience, what is the message you're giving to them, what are their needs, then it kind of focuses in on whether a podcast is a good way to deliver the message to them.
Right. And even within the genre, there are a bunch of different ways to create podcasts and to format.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And to, what I know that the sort of the micro podcast is a thing, and it never really appealed to me because I like to talk, and I like to get deeper into these issues. I've had the same experience listening to someone's podcast and thinking, oh wait, I want you to talk about that more.
Yeah.
And then you're left with nothing. For some people, it's for some people that's the right fit for them, and they just want to kind of get out there. But I think, I've seen people who are even quite introverted who have really gotten into their podcast and really see it's for some reason it's more accessible. I like video too. I do a live stream every day, and that's really comfortable. But a lot of people, that is not comfortable because it feels too risky, and they don't like the pressure of being put on the spot. Where if you're doing a podcast, you could re-record if you needed to, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It seems like a really good sort of in-between step for folks who are not all that comfortable being out and visible, but also knows that they want to do something, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it is a lot easier from the editing point of view. So editing video is much more complex because you've got the visual part as well as the audio. And sometimes, if you do a live recording in particular, sometimes you get lags between the visual and the audio. So if you want a really high quality product, then you've got to address that lag, and that's quite a bit of editing work. Whereas the audio, you've just got that one layer, if you like, of editing to do. So for example, if I'm doing too many which is one of my favorite filler words, or sometimes an slips in. And if I want to remove those, well, then that auditing is just really just finding them in the sequence and cutting them out. Whereas in video, it's a little bit more complicated.
I found a really great application actually for this, because I was editing in sort of the big heavy video editing applications. And I stumbled across this one where you actually do the editing based on the words. And so when you look for the words, it transcribes it all. You look for the words, you just highlight those, cut it out, and it edits the video right in place. And it's brilliant. It's one of the best applications I've found so far. Yeah, it's really cool.
What's that called?
It's called Descript.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'll have to look that up.
Early day. I know I just stumbled across it, but that's what I find really fun about podcasting too, is like it appeals to my technical background and my technical side too. And so you do have to be a little comfortable with some of that, but there are some great applications out there for making this as easy as possible. And it's become a lot more accessible, I think. Is that true?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing is, particularly with a conversation like this, it doesn't have to be perfect. So a lot of people will listen into a really interesting conversation. The important thing is that it's interesting, the content is valuable to the audience you're speaking to. And if there's some things that are not quite right, for example, if I'm saying too many you knows or ums, that's not that important, because people see me as human.
Well, that's the gist behind this show too, is to make everybody just human. We're not putting high production value. We're not making glossy. These are like human beings behind business. And that's what I think is missing out there in the world right now, are these really accessible conversations and the normalization, because there's so much out there that glorifies online business and business entrepreneurship, but really we're all just making messes out here, right? We're all just being
that's right,
and trying our best.
Yeah, and you learn from doing it. So I certainly, if you listen back to some of my early episodes, they were very heavily scripted, as I mentioned, so they're a little stilted. I possibly didn't have as many ums and filler words in there because I was following a script, but I'm absolutely convinced that now I'm much better at it. And I typically ask my guests at the end of the show, after we wrap up the recording, is there something I can do better? Give me some feedback. And there's occasionally a good suggestion of something I can do better, but 9 times out of 10 people say, oh, you did fabulously. And, they'll say things like, I've been on lots of podcasts and this is one of the best ones I've been on. You were really well prepared. You sent us all the briefing materials well in advance, so I knew what to expect. You gave us reminders regularly. We schedule out 3 months, 4 months in advance, so we have regular reminders going out. So all of those things. So people have given us feedback that, and all of these things that they point out, we've implemented over time, because we thought, well, actually, somebody didn't turn up for a show. Well, how can we remind people to make sure that it's on their calendars when it's 4 months out, but that they're also reminded perhaps the day before? So all of these things, as well as your own performance and how you feel on camera or in front of the microphone, they improve with just doing it.
Oh, I agree. So what makes a podcast good from a listener's perspective?
Well, I think what I said earlier, first of all, that it's actually giving value to that listener. So what are they looking for? And making sure that you're giving that value, that it's interesting and engaging. And that's where a conversation between people is often more interesting and engaging. If you're doing something solo, that's a bit more challenging to make it interesting and engaging. If you're doing solo podcasts, I think you probably need to do a lot more scripting there, but it's about finding stories that highlight the points you're making. One of the things I like to do is have 3 takeaways per episode. So I pare it back to the minimum, but then with those three takeaways, have some interesting story that highlights why it's important and perhaps gives an example of how that applies in the real world. So there are a couple of the key things. And the other thing is the length of a podcast. So again, this is important to know the audience. So if your audience is primarily listening on their morning commute to work, for example, you need to know, well, how long is that? And I think there's lots of statistics around that 20 minutes is kind of a typical number there. Now, I know that lots of people in different large cities around the world probably commute much more than that, but it seems that 20 minutes right across the world seems to be an average number that people work on there for a podcast that gets consumed while people are commuting.
Well, could they consume the first part in their commute, their morning commute, and the last part in their, their evening commute? Because you've got them for at least the day.
Yeah, that's right. So the other thing to consider there is if you do have a longer one, how could it be broken up? Because the other beauty of listening to podcasts is with the podcast apps, when you stop, let's say you get to the office after 20 minutes and you stop that podcast, well, next time you turn it back on, it starts again at that particular point.
Yeah, I find that I'm often doing that. I'll listen for half the episode and then I'll finish the episode a little bit later on. So what's the marketing opportunity? Because you kind of followed this path into marketing, and then now you're focusing quite heavily on podcasts. So taking your marketing background, why should someone start a podcast? Why should they consider it as part of, I think it's a marketing tool, but why should they consider it as part of their marketing?
Yeah. There's a number of things about podcasting. First of all, it's a really growing medium. So everybody's getting into it now. I mean, Spotify, the music streaming app, has invested millions in the last year and a half, I think, in getting into podcasting in a big way, which is, to me, is a sign that, there's a big future for podcasting. Google have launched a podcast-specific search now, and they're starting to rank podcasts. So, in the old days where if you did a search for someone or something, the YouTube would come after about 3 or 4 posts. YouTube videos would start to show up in the feed, so you could actually click on the search page onto a YouTube video and play the video there. They've started doing that now with podcasts. So you'll see in some searches that podcasts will come up as part of the search page, and the player will be there, so that they can click on the episode itself and listen straight away. So these things just highlight that podcasting is a really big thing now going forward. So I think it's something that is going to get a lot more attention. From a listener's point of view, it's very convenient. I mean, all you need is your phone in your pocket and you can listen to podcasts. And as you said before, if somebody's listening to half your podcast episode on their way to work and then the half coming back, you've essentially got their attention for the whole day. And it's very intimate because they've got you in their ears. So getting that message out there is through podcasting is a really great way for connecting with your audience. From the marketing point of view, I mean, it's one marketing tactic. So it needs to be placed in the context of your overall marketing strategy and what you're aiming to do with your whole business and your marketing tactics. The other thing about the podcast, I mean, we talked about it's pretty easy to get started, and once you develop some experience as a podcaster, you'll get better and better at presenting or at hosting or at being a guest, whatever ways you do it. The other part of it that is really important is you do have to spend a lot of time on marketing the podcast. So actually producing it and writing the content and recording the shows and editing the shows is probably about 20% of the work. 80% of the work is actually marketing that podcast and marketing each episode to make sure that people are aware there's a new episode, and there's a lot of things you can do there. So the marketing side of it is really important.
To me, it's kind of the perfect vehicle for marketing because you're just having conversations, right? And that's what we do all the time, all day anyway. But I think like the intimacy is really important that you mentioned that, audio video is popular for a reason because we don't we get an extra layer of information about the people who are creating the content, whereas if I was just reading an article, I don't connect with the author, I just read the content. But I also think that this is like this really interesting opportunity for us to build something more rich than what we've typically had in the past. And I wonder, like, where is the innovation going within podcasting? What's
Yeah, that's
happening with the industry?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there's a few things happening. I mean, one of the other things that is starting to happen in the industry is a lot of the big players are getting involved. I mean, the radio and TV, well, radio in particular was a very early adopter because they've got all the technology right there and then. So there's lots of radio shows, certainly in Australia, and I know in the US, that have a podcast as part of their whole programming. And TV shows now are doing this as well. So you can be a fan of a particular TV show, and there'll be the producers or the network will have a podcast around that TV show. But then there's third-party independent podcasters, actually, like you and I. If we're fans of some TV show, we could start a podcast and have a conversation of the latest episode, what happened in the latest episode, and what did you think of so-and-so in that episode, as an actor, or you could have these conversations. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. And I think the future of podcasting, I think it's just going to grow a lot more. The live streaming thing for video, like we're doing now, is in play in podcasting. So you can do live podcast streams. I'm not aware that a lot of people are doing it, but I think that's an interesting concept. And the other thing is there are more and more podcasting apps for recording podcasts coming on for your mobile phone. So you could be somewhere out and about and see something and just immediately, spur of the moment, do a live podcast, if you like, straight off the phone. So I think those are some of... Yeah, Anchor's one of them, but I think there's others. Well, does Anchor do live? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I'm not. I've played around with it, but I haven't done much with it. But I think there's a bigger message here, and I don't think it's new information that marketing works better when you create deeper connection with the people that you're trying to reach. And I think that there's a story here about the human side of marketing and why, a vehicle like a podcast or something where there's just richer information about who you're connecting to. In this world of marketing, we're all trying to create personal brands, right? Even if you're working within a big corporation, it is beneficial for you to create a personal brand. So I think that's why we're seeing so much uptake with podcasts, because they're like that great sort of first step, and that they provide a whole lot more rich information. But part of what you came on talking about was the fact that you want to bring a more of a human side to marketing. And is this why you have followed podcasting and started to focus more specifically on that?
Yeah, it's possibly why I enjoy it so much. Yeah. But you're right, the human aspect is important, and video, you mentioned video, I think that's really important as well, because as you said earlier, you can get the connection with people, you can see their response, how their facial expression changes. So if you say something to them, they smile or frown, you can sort of get a sense of how they're responding to what you're saying, and that gives another layer to the conversation. When you're presenting via video to a bigger audience, that brings up some other challenges, but it certainly, done well, it can really bring that connection about. So the podcasting with the audio. It's kind of like if you imagine, instead of writing someone an email and outlining what needs to be done, is you pick up the telephone and you have a conversation with them about it. So, that's the human approach to it, as opposed to sending an email, which is very much more transactional. And so writing a blog post can be like the email, it's very transactional, whereas getting on a podcast and speaking to the person is much more human connection.
And so how do we build podcasting into our strategy? Like what is the best way for somebody who's just starting out to get into it and to start creating one?
What I'd suggest is, again, looking back at the overall objective. So what's the product or service you're offering? Who's the target market, and how do you reach them? And then look at what are the steps. So if you're selling a small item, it's probably much simpler. But if you're selling, let's say, a big service like a coaching program that is ongoing over time, that's something that people don't decide on the spur of the moment. It's something that you need to build a relationship with first. So you look at what are the touch points that you want to establish and build that relationship to the point where they then say, yes, I want to buy your service or buy your product. So you look at the end result, which is having the person on board as a client, and work your way back from that to look at the touch points. And podcasting could be one of those touch points, and it could be a very early touch point so that people learn about you. You can tell them about your product or service in the podcast, but the main purpose of the podcast is to display that, one, you have the know-how and the skills and the experience to deliver that service or product, and two, that you, particularly if you're going to go down the route of doing an interview podcast, that you actually have connections or are able to make connections with other people who have varied expertise that you can bring to the table. So the first place you bring that to the table is through the podcast. And then, of course, when you as a podcaster are connecting with those people and building those relationships, you have the opportunity to partner with them in all kinds of ways to bring more value to your own clients. So looking at that part of it, and then looking at where in your customer journey is podcasting as the touch point, what are the other touch points, and how do you then take someone who's a podcast listener and move them through that journey. So one of the key things is having a call to action in the podcast as to what's the next step. You've listened to this information, you've heard Stephanie and I talking about this topic. What's the next step? So how can you find out more? And that might be as simple as, we have a blog post that goes with this episode, and in the blog post, there's some worksheets that will help you do the things I'm talking about. So go and have a look at those worksheets. So that might be the next step in the customer journey. And so that's another touch point. It's building on that relationship. It might be as simple as come back next week, because next week on the episode, we're talking to another person that is going to contribute knowledge to this area.
What I find is interesting is that there have been quite a few people on my podcast who are actually clients of mine too. It's just the way it worked out, right? I open up the podcast to anybody who's part of my group who wants to be interviewed, and I've almost found that some of them are almost like case studies, right? And
yeah,
they allow me to sort of talk through the work that I've done with and that's certainly not the point of them, and certainly not my intention. But from a marketing perspective, it's actually been really good, and people have been listening to the podcast. They're getting good information from somebody. Then we're also talking about the work that we're doing together, and they become almost like these little mini case studies. So it's an interest. I find that podcasts have been such a multifaceted solution from a marketing perspective in a lot of different ways. And because they're both helpful, even just on their own, they're super helpful to the people who are listening, but also they create credibility. They create a brand. I've had people hire me because they said, "Oh, I listened to you on the podcast and I realized that you know this and you know that, and that you're a good fit for me." So there's like this brand recognition that comes along with getting to know somebody. And I don't know. I'm a huge fan, and I
Yeah.
think they're great. You have started to focus just on coaches and consultants, right? In your business?
Yeah.
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 So tell me a little bit
Particularly.
about.
Okay. So one of the things I've learned over my journey is that every time I focus more narrowly, the business actually grows, which is counterintuitive at the first moment, but actually it's not. And one of the things that we do in all of our programs, whether it's a marketing program or it's podcasting program, is we start off with who is the ideal client or who is the ideal listener. And we go through this exercise of really getting clear about who that might be, and then going deep in terms of understanding what are their frustrations, what are their needs and wants, what are the things that keep them awake at night, what are their aspirations, and how does your product or service fit into that? How are you going to take them from where they currently are to their desired state? So when I went through that exercise for myself, and one of the things I do, particularly in the marketing one, when we talk ideal client, because it's a little abstract when people first start this, is I say, well, particularly if you have some clients right now, who is the one client that you love working with? So if I told you that you're going to be stranded on a desert island for the next 10 years with one client, who would be the client you'd choose? Because it would make that experience actually paradise. So I kind of frame that. And for me, that was a couple of the business coaches that I worked with, because I just related really well to them. Whenever I did a presentation of something new or tried out something new, they were the ones that responded and said, "Oh, this is awesome. I love this stuff." Whereas some other clients or other audiences would kind of glaze over and say, ho hum. So that was how I modeled my ideal client, and then I really got to know them really well. And I also focus on coaches and consultants that actually work mainly in the technical, manufacturing, or healthcare is another one, industries, because that kind of has a lot in common with my own background from my corporate experience. So there's the attitudes, beliefs, culture, language, all those kind of things. I can think back to experiences I've had way back in my corporate career that actually helped me in those interactions. So that was why I focused on them. And
Okay.
also the other thing, I mean, I really want to make a difference to my clients, and making a difference to people that are particularly business coaches. I know that by helping them get out in front of their ideal clients and connect and engage with their ideal clients, that they're going to make a big difference to a whole bunch of other people. So I get to have kind of a secondary effect on a whole lot of people.
So you've really focused on alignment within your own business, and that has made it a
Mm.
lot more enjoyable for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And what has growth meant for you? I mean, what's worked for you in terms of growth?
Um, that's a really good question. And I guess in the early days, I had this vision of, the Michael E. Gerber thing. I build all these systems, which I've done. I kind of scale it up really radically and grow and start to franchise it out to a whole lot of people. And at some point I realized that wasn't really what I wanted to do. It was just kind of what the E-Myth, the model that the E-Myth books put out there, that was how you scaled a business. So what, for me, growth has been, building the business to the point where it's sustainable, and I can step away from it for 4 weeks if I like, for a holiday, and the business continues and the clients are still getting what they need. Also that, the team I have is being looked after so that their needs are met, but they're also happy and serving the client the way I want to serve the client. But it's also, growth to me is not just about, more business and more money. It's also about the learning that I get and the learning we get as a company, the learnings that my team get, so that how they grow as people and their skill set grows. To me, that's really important. I mean, entrepreneurship is a hell of a learning journey, and it's something that I've really enjoyed. I think the lessons I've had in my time in entrepreneurship beat any other education that I've had during my life. And that's really important for me. That's kind of one of the things that drives me, is learning new things, and I always enjoy. So, I'll be digging into the new video app that you've told me about today. That always excites me. So there's something new I can learn here, and particularly if it opens up other opportunities. So for me, growth is kind of a bigger picture thing that it's not just about growing the business for the sake of growing the business.
You need to grow as a person and individually. And this is everything that we talk about all the time in terms of alignment.
Yeah.
Is that I believe that people who own their own businesses need to build businesses around themselves and start with themselves and understand themselves really well in order to build a business that is structured in the way that makes them really happy, and they work in the way that they want to work. They're working with the people they want to work with. They're creating offers that are aligned with their skills and how they like to work, and it's all interrelated, right? But we forget about that. We have these businesses that are basically
that's right,
tumbleweed,
and
right?
Yeah, and of course it's difficult at the beginning when you need to generate revenue. You've got costs that you have to bear. If you've got a mortgage, you've got family, you've got school fees, you've got cars to pay for because you have to drive the kids to school, so you can't do without the car. So we're all in situations like that where we need to take on board clients to pay the bills. So I understand that. But at some point, you've got to say, okay, now we've got to that critical mass of there's enough money there to sustain my lifestyle. So now I need to be really choosy.
Yes.
And thinking of your own well-being and your own personal growth, the more customers you have that are really good match for you, that that sing your praises. I mean, they're part of your marketing team. So if they're really happy, they sing your praises out in the wide world. That marketing is priceless. So the more of those that you have, the better it is, not only for your marketing but also for your own well-being.
And that, I mean, with your particular target client, that is so true, maybe even more than with others. We very much rely on this referral network, and I would say 98% of my clients come from referrals, and that's just so what can I do to keep that front of mind within my referral network? And I think this is a great opportunity to do that. So what's next for you? What's next for you in your business?
Well, I mentioned earlier that we were looking at putting together some training programs. So one of the things that I'm working with my own business coach, who's also a client of mine, is putting together a live 2-day workshop around podcasting, but it's going to be looking at it from a different angle. So we're still developing this idea, but it might be some of the technical aspects of podcasting and how to get started, but it's going to be heavily focused on the communication side of it, looking at how do you communicate really well with your audience, and what are the things that you need to be aware of there, and how do you communicate really well if you're having a two-way conversation or a conversation with someone else or with others on the podcast. How do you structure that communication from and there? It's not just during the episode, it's like from the point when you first invite the people to come onto the podcast, and again through that journey, because that in a way is kind of a customer journey, bringing that by the time they come on the podcast, and then also afterwards. So we're looking at that, and we're going to be looking at the whole communication part from a neuro-linguistic programming point of view, because that's her specialty. And so there's a lot of lessons there that we can impart in terms of how do you get yourself in a position where unconsciously you're actually doing a lot of these really cool things that have these great communications and add huge value to not only the audience, but also the people that are on the show as well. So that's one thing that we're working on. I'm also thinking about looking at an online training program, a boutique training program that's going to go over 8 weeks for starting a podcast and marketing a podcast. And again, with the differentiator, how do you be a really good podcast host? And if you're wanting to get on other people's podcasts as a guest, how can you be a really good guest?
Awesome. You just totally piqued my interest there with the neuralist. I mean, clearly I like the very intellectual stuff. So
Yeah.
neurolinguistic programming in this kind of medium, I mean, that's really interesting. I can't wait to see what you come up with.
Yeah.
Super fun. Okay, so I just want to be respectful of your time. We're coming up on almost an hour. I figured we could probably spend another hour talking about
Yeah.
all of this good stuff. I'd love to dig into scaling your business and all of that sort of thing. But tell me a little bit about what kind of support you need from this community. Like, how can this community help you?
Well, certainly getting the word out about my podcast, which is Innova Buzz. That's one way that the community can help, and also providing feedback. So if you do listen to an episode, send me an email or contact me through LinkedIn is probably the place I'm most active on social media. Just let me know what you thought. Give me some feedback, good or bad. What works well, what can I do better? That will be really helpful.
Awesome. I love that you're open for the dialogue, because I think that's smart from your perspective, and it's smart for your customers as well. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I know we could probably continue to chat forever.
Yeah.
Can you tell
Well,
the
thanks,
listeners
Stephanie.
can you tell our listeners how they can find you?
Yeah, so my website is innovabiz, innovabiz.com.au. And the podcast is called Innova Buzz. So it's the same first half with BUZZ. And if you just go .com, you'll find the podcast there.
Awesome. We'll put the links in the show notes to all of your stuff as well, so they can find you.
And if you search for me, you'll find my LinkedIn profile as well. So as I say, that's where I'm most active on social media.
On LinkedIn. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You've got a really interesting business model that and I like seeing how it's progressed over time and your focus. I think this is a real big takeaway for a lot of people who are listening, that interestingly enough, the more focused you get, the more successful your business becomes, and the easier it is to get those clients on board. And I know I'm learning that lesson right now too.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and to share my story.
Yes, thank you. And that's a wrap for this episode. Such an amazing conversation. Make sure you go and check out Jürgen and all of his amazing work that he's doing in the podcasting space and in the marketing space and in the innovation space. I think these are all combined. And thank you for tuning in today to hear this story. The episodes that you're listening to are all featuring members of my free private Facebook group called the Real Deal Business Coaching Group, where we have daily prompts to keep you focused on building your business and sharing your everyday challenges. We have bi-weekly virtual coffee chats, open coaching, and member support in this incredible community. If you'd like to join us, or if you would like to be featured on this show, I would love for you to come hang out with us in the group. Links in the show notes, or search us up in Real Deal Business Coaching in Facebook to find us. And finally, I'd love for you to join us next episode, where we're going to be speaking to Erica Tebbins, who's one of my favorite human beings. She's a business coach who helps women entrepreneurs grow and scale their businesses with simple and sleaze-free strategies so they can make a greater impact and income. So thank you again for being here. If you've enjoyed today's content, I'd love for you to give us a review on whatever platform you're on, because this helps us share our stories with an even bigger audience. Until next time, keep building, keep dreaming, and keep being real.